Hey, welcome back to another tutorial. This is part 3 of the dynamic variable series, and today we're going to go over the components. Again, this is going to be heavy on theory, so I apologize if that's not your jam. There are some tutorials coming down the line that will be sort of next or after this one, where we talk about sort of practical applications for dynamic variables and talk about how they work. This one is just meant to be a reference for how all the components work and some sort of notes or pointers about how I would recommend that you use the various components that are available. The reason behind this is that there are a lot, and I get them confused all the time, as do other people, because their naming gets a little bit sort of spaghetti-like, but that's fine. If you've got a visual guide, you can go through them. It'll also help me reinforce what they are in my head too as I show you them. Let's go. So I'm going to go in smooth POV here. Like I said, this is going to be a bit theoretical, and so we're going to have to, basically stare at an inspector for quite a long time. I'll try and make it as interesting as possible. Do let me know what you think. And if you have any questions, let them know in the video description, or comments, not the description, yeah. Cool, so starting off, I've got a space up here called space, and we're going to attach a dynamic variable space to it. This is just to tell you how the various parts of dynamic variable spaces work in isolation. So we're going to go to attach component, data, dynamic variable space. That's right at the bottom. It's the blue one inside the dynamic variable folder. Okay, so you'll see the usual traditional values, persistent, update, order, and enabled. Those are fine, we'll ignore them. Then onwards is the space name. Now, we talked about the space name in part 2, which I'll link in the video description, but the space name is a named distinguisher that you can allow dynamic variables to bind to using that space name. The way that you do that is you specify a dynamic variable using a pattern. Let me show you text basic here. Use the space's name here, so we do space name, and then a /, and then the variable's name here. This allows you to sort of organize your dynamic variables into a series of hierarchies and a series of orders, etc., that make it easy to figure out, what space you're looking at. So you can go ahead and hit whatever you want on here. For now, we're just going to go ahead and we're going to use, let's use tutorial, not lesson. That's a little too formal. Tutorial. So we're going to name our dynamic variable space tutorial. You can leave this blank. If you leave this blank, any dynamic variables below it that don't have space name stroke on the front of it, they will bind to this. This is an easy way to kind of explore them, is to just leave space name blank. Beneath that is only direct binding. Only direct binding means that you will only allow dynamic variables into this dynamic variable space that have the space name that's specified here in their variable name. If this isn't checked, then unnamed variables can also bind into this variable space. So if I leave this unchecked, then the, let's make another piece of text here, then any variable name, so we just say potato here, would be able to bind into this space because only direct binding is disabled. But if only direct binding is enabled, only variables that have the variable space name in them, so in this case tutorial, will be able to bind to it. So now if I made a variable with the name potato, it would not bind, but if I named the variable tutorial / potato, it would bind. That's all the properties of dynamic variable spaces. We'll come back to them as we make more and more sort of other parts of the video, but that's dynamic variable spaces as a component. We're going to go into dumping ground now, which is a comically named space for me to sort of show you more of the components. I will try to put the timestamps below about where the different components are registered, and that way you can jump around to them. I did consider doing a video for each component, but as they basically do the same thing, it'll be a lot of repetition and 10 plus videos, so I didn't really want to do that. I'm also going to try and sort of group together the reference and value types, so I'm actually going to go over those first before I talk about them. To do that, I'm actually going to use the data folder here to use value fields and reference fields, because those are exactly the same for dynamic variables. You can use values or references, and it's sometimes unclear what these mean. So a value, for example, a value in this value field, is any sort of primitive data type. So bool, int, string, all the various types of numbers, long, float, ulong, etc. There's many types of numbers. Color, anything that's like a basic value that can be expressed without any sort of complexity goes in a value field. So here I have a value field bool. A reference is anything which is more complicated, so anything that is like a class in C# land. If that doesn't make sense to you or not familiar with programming, think about references being anything that can't really exist twice. So in this case, I am a user and I can only exist once in a world. If I duplicate myself, then weird things will happen, like there'll be another character over there in the distance sort of, moving or acting like me. That's weird. So we use a reference to refer back to the original value of the user, which is created once at the sort of root of the world. So that's a reference field. Reference fields don't have what are called generic types, which is where you see here are some options, so you have to type them usually. I myself here use Turk's keyboard, and Turk's keyboard has a few helpful parts here. Let me turn on private UI here. So I can go to the type field here, and then I can type slot, and that will place slot in here, and I can create a reference field for a type of slot. I know we jumped around there back to the non-dynamic variables. I haven't done a video on the value fields or the reference fields because they are quite straightforward. They were used a lot before dynamic variables, but now dynamic variables have landed. I believe they'll be used a lot more. So we're going to go ahead and delete those. That's just the difference between a value and a reference. Maybe I'll make a separate video about that, but right now it's included in this one because it's going to come up a lot. All right, so data, dynamic. And this is where things start getting long. I'm actually going to make this larger, and we're going to leave this one open so I can kind of point and gesture at it. So right off the bat, you'll see that there are two items at the top here called DynamicField and DynamicReference. These both work the same way. What they do is they're used for cases whereby the value of a dynamic variable isn't stored within the component. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's create a dynamic field here, and we'll use bool. I actually said I was going to leave that there, so I'm going to go ahead and create another one here, and I will leave that one to the side over there. Cool. So this here has a dynamic field bool that's been created, and it's saying here the variable name. So we're going to do we're going to bind into the tutorial namespace, and we're going to call it A. Just A is fine. But you'll see here that there is no input box for what the value of tutorial_A is. It's like, how do we specify a value? In this case, it's asking for a target field. What the target field here means is where is this value stored? So you can use dynamic field for things like where other components have the hierarchy and the value that's available. So for example here, a good thing that you might want to bind into dynamic field that's a bool is the active property of a slot here. So now you'll see that the value of dynamic field tutorial_A is this target field active. And so anyone that's listening to tutorial A as a variable will then pick up the value that is shown in the active field here. So if this was false and anyone listened to tutorial_A anywhere else in their, in the space hierarchy, they would see false now, and then they would see true. That's dynamic field for you. And just to prove it, but I don't want to talk about it too much, we'll go for type slot. Here we are. You'll see here exactly the same thing, variable name and target reference. So again, it's storing the reference in another field. So in this case, you could use the parent field up here, which is a reference to a slot. So I could go ahead and grab parent and drop it into the target reference here, and you'll see it there. And I can go ahead and name this a tutorial_B, and now there's a B variable, which is referring to the target reference up here. So that's dynamic field and dynamic reference, useful for when you have a value not inside the component. We'll do the opposite of that, which is the next one, which is dynamic reference variable and dynamic value variable. These things are usually paired. There's a pairing between the two components, reference and value. So once you know one side, you can usually know the other, but we will cover both. So we'll do a dynamic value variable now. So dynamic value variable is a more primitive value that we just talked about. So we can store any of these. You can also store some others that aren't mentioned here, but they get a little bit weird. Let's go ahead and use a string, as there's a little bit more variation here. So again, here you'll see that we've got the variable name field, but we haven't got that target field. Instead, we can actually specify the value within the dynamic value variable component. So in this case here, I can go ahead and do tutorial C, and then I can actually put a value in. So we can say here potato, And now tutorial-c has the value of potato. I should have covered this on the previous components, but they do appear a lot, is override on link. Override on link, when it's checked, will basically override the value in a dynamic variable space with the value that is either specified in the field for DynamicField and DynamicReference, or the value here for DynamicValueVariable and DynamicReferenceVariable. This is useful if you know that there is an authority for this figure. So for example, if there's a variable floating around called ammo, and there's a new gun or a new thing that needs to contain ammo, then you might want to turn on override on link, because it means that when you interact with that gun, or you create a new gun, it'll override it back to the default value. There's actually a better way of coping with override on link and sort of authorities, which we'll cover in just a couple more components, but it's an option available to you. I'm going to go ahead and actually I need to double check my positioning here. Oh yeah, we're good. I've got an offset going on. Yeah, cool. So we'll go to dynamic reference variable now, which is here, dynamic reference variable. And again, here it needs a type, so we'll go down to type and we'll use slot again, nice and simple. And here you'll see it's asking for a reference. In this regard, it's kind of similar to the dynamic reference. You might confuse these two. What it's asking for here, though, is a field which contains a reference and not a reference itself. So you'll notice here that if I put actually, that works strange. Oh no, that does work because of that. Okay, so if I put the parent field in here, you'll see it doesn't link because that isn't a slot. It's a field which contains a reference to the slot. So it's asking for a reference. So here, if we drag the word space, we can then set that as a reference. And again, we can go ahead and set that to D. So that is dynamic value variable and dynamic reference variable. I use these a lot, especially when I talk and I make sort of the hierarchy and the authority values of various variables that I use. I will talk more about that when I start doing sort of actual practical examples of using this system. So we're going to go ahead and clear those and move on to the next one. The next one we're going to do is the drivers. There is a driver for the data type, the value type and the reference type again. So we'll add and talk about both. So here is DynamicValueVariableDriver. This one is where the mouthful I spoke about starts happening. I just scan read these and I look for the keyword right at the end here, because that always changes. You'll see variable, reset, driver, blah, 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 blah. So that's what I look for. So DynamicValueVariableDriver T, and we're going to do color here. Color is my favorite sort of dynamic variable to play because it's super visual and it lets you know what's going on almost immediately. And so what we'll do here is we'll go ahead and also create a value field of type color as well, so we can show you how it drives. So here what we're going to do is just name it again, tutorial. We'll call this one color. And then it says target. And what this means is, because it's a dynamic value variable driver, it's going to drive the field that we put into target to the value of tutorial color. So you'll see here, if I drop the word value into here by grabbing it and dropping it in, now it's driving, as evidenced by this pink coloring, it's driving the value of this value field here. You can use that for, shapes, colors, etc. Refer back to part 1 also in the video description, which will show you how to use dynamic value variable driver color to do a few things involving color. You'll also notice that these components have a default value. This is what happens if there is no value found in the dynamic variable space. So for example here, if I wanted to be sure that there was always a color, like for example it defaulted to white, then I could do that. And what it would mean is if they couldn't find a color, then it would set it to white. So you can see there is no tutorial stroke color variable available, so it's driving it to white. If I go ahead and very quickly, if I add a dynamic value variable of color, and I copy across the link there, and then I go ahead and I change this value, let's say to red. You'll now see that this is the value that we're setting, and then the dynamic value variable driver here is driving this value here to red. And if I change this again, say we go to like a blue, you'll see it's driving it to blue. So that's what the DynamicValueVariableDriver does. The same thing goes there with the reference. I won't create an example for that, but it allows you to drive a reference. Good references to drive are things like slots and users and materials and stuff like that. You can really affect sort of a material or an object quite a lot if you have some dynamic variables hooked up to the materials. Maybe I'll cover that in a separate video. It's a little bit sort of spaghetti to type that one right now. So that is the drivers and the values and the fields. Next one is the reset. I'm going to have to talk about that one with a pairing, which I like to sort of use when I talk about the reset one. So for the reset one, let's go ahead and add it. DynamicValueVariableReset. Double check. Yeah, some of these don't have generic types. I do have a GitHub issue open. I'll put that in the video description as well. Please thumbs up it if you want generic types on those. And we'll do color again. Color is a lowercase c if it's a type. Yep, there we go. So here, what you can see is that we've got, again, the variable name. So we could do here tutorial. I think I did capital, so color. And then it has options here, and this basically allows you to automatically reset something. So it has checkboxes for what type of reset you want. It has reset on load, reset on duplicate, and reset on paste. So on load is when the object loads. That's if it's a part of a world, when the world loads. Or if it's an object, that's when you spawn it in from your inventory. Duplicate is when you duplicate it, as in with the duplicate menus. Here's a cube, and I'm going to grab it and go ahead and duplicate it. That's a duplicate. So that will reset on duplicate. That's useful if you've got sort of a templating object that you're cloning a lot of, you know, like a cake, whatever, and you're picking up a slice, you know, that's a duplicate of the cake or something. Grab instance is a good use of reset on duplicate as well, because that will be a duplicate. I'll link my grab instance video in the video description as well. Paste is when you paste it between worlds. So, you know, if I take this cube, I grab it, I open up the world switcher, or I use I open up the world switcher and I use that to sort of take it between worlds. I'm not actually sure how you paste with the new world browser. I'll have to think about that one. Oh, and then reset value is the value that it gets reset to. What I usually encourage people to do in this case is I encourage them to store a dynamic value variable or reference variable with the reset so that you know the current value and you can sort of test that it's working. So here I might go ahead and create a dynamic value variable of color and copy the name in here. And so what this allows you to see is like, hey, did the reset actually happen? And then I call this sort of in my head, I haven't formalized this sort of taxonomy actually, but I call this like the authority slot. So I might create a slot at the top of my object which says color, and it has the reset in it and it has the value variable in it. And if I ever want to go see at a moment's notice what the value of tutorial color was in my world or in my setup, I would go there because I'd be able to see it and I'd be able to edit it really quickly. That is dynamic value variable reset. There is the same for references. Again, I won't show you that one because it's pretty much the same thing. I'm trying to keep the video lighter, I guess. Reference variable set. We will need a slot again for that. So you've got here variable name. Reset target would be what it resets it to. So in this case, it will be we can reset this variable, say tutorial slot, to space here, again on load, duplicate, or paste. So that's dynamic reference variable reset. All right, the last one here is the dynamic variable status one. This one's new and I actually haven't used it that much, but it should be useful in certain setups. I'll talk about it now. Here it is, dynamic variable status. This is a type here that appears to only take values. It might not take references at the time. We can double check by just hitting type here, and oh, it does both. So it does values and things like that. It might actually crash when I put in a reference. There was an old bug with the value fields, where if you tried to put a slot into a value field, it was crash. I'll try that out after the video and put in the video description my success of that. I don't want to risk it because I'm halfway through this video. Okay, so if we did a dynamic value variable, dynamic variable status on, let's do color again. You'll see here that it has a status about what the variable is. So if we do again here tutorial, stroke color, You'll see here currently that it is linked to a space because it's linked to the space above it here. But you'll see that the variable exists checkmark is not checked. That's because the variable doesn't exist. If I were to go ahead and create a dynamic variable, value variable this time of type color, and I copy the description across, and then I change the color to say, hey, red, and fully visible. Now you'll see it says variable exists. So you could use that for component setups where you wanted to sort of display something if there wasn't a value that exists or if a variable was unlinked. We'll talk about that more again in sort of practical examples, because when you start doing practical examples, you need to make sure that your variables are linked and that the variable exists before you do an interaction. Like, for example, here, if you're trying to make a decision point, like, you know, if the box is red, then kill the player, you want to make sure that there's actually a variable that exists there and there's a value that exists there before you make that decision point, or you may end up making the wrong decision. That's actually it for the dynamic variable components. I know it might look like I haven't covered them all. I'm actually doubting it myself, but I have. We did fields. Those are for when you store it in another location. Reference is the same as the field here. Reference variable and value variable are when you store it in the actual component with it. Drivers are when you drive another field somewhere else to that value. And reset is where you want to go ahead and reset it to some value on paste, load, or duplicate. And then status is the status of that. We also covered DynamicVariableSpace again. I talked more sort of concretely about those in part 1, so go ahead and do those. That's it for part 3. Again, I apologize for the theory, but that's just the way things go right now. This concept is very new, and we need to talk about a lot of theory before we can actually, you know, get on and build stuff. I do want to cover the nodes next. The nodes start getting sort of complicated, and I may have to skip them and go into sort of practical applications. You may be thinking, hey, why are we going to the logics nodes in part 4? But again, it's super important that you understand all this theory before you start using the nodes. Otherwise, you may end up making a mess where you have lots of variables around or you don't know where they are, because the nodes allow for an immense amount of flexibility that can be a sort of burden to your setup if you're not keeping track on them and, you know, making sure that you're being sort of the cowboy for them, if you like. I'll see you next time for nodes. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. I will see you later. Bye-bye.